IT is a huge risk to OT. There's been several instances where the IT and OT were connected. Someone got ransomware, and that went into the systems, and then everybody had to run in manual for an extended amount of time. While many plants can run in manual, not all of them can. And so that can be a very dangerous situation.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the #1 best-selling CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CISOs and cybersecurity thought leaders. Listen to previous CISO Stories episodes at securityweekly.com/CSP. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Mea Clift, Head of Cybersecurity at Woodard & Curran. Hi, it's great to be here today with Mea Clift. And Mea, tell us, what attracted you to the cybersecurity field?
So I was in IT for years, and I got to the point where I was trying to decide where I wanted to go next. You could go into architecture, you could go into management, you could do those kinds of situations, but there really wasn't anything that was really attractive. So I ended up getting on a government contract, and I was supposed to do vulnerability management, and they said, "Oh, we need you to do security work." And I'm like, okay, what does that mean? And I got into GRC, and it was really great because I was able to use all of my experience, both in customer service and in my IT skill set, and being able to see that bigger picture. So I'm able to take all of my experiences together and shape the cybersecurity posture of an organization and be able to translate it to all the different levels of the business, which is really kind of awesome.
So you're kind of a big picture person, because a lot of security people seem to be like down in the weeds, right? So you had that bigger picture view.
I did. I think it really depends on where you're going in cybersecurity, but as you move up, you need to see that bigger picture. You can't get lost in the weeds because you can't mistake the forest for the trees, because the tree is part of the forest, and one tree can topple the entire ecosystem. So getting down into the nitty-gritty of that one root set doesn't help you understand how to protect the entire forest.
I love that analogy. I think that's great for cybersecurity. So today we're going to be talking about IT and OT security. So what was your interest in OT security, and how do we look at these differently?
So I fell into it just like I have with most of cybersecurity, it seems. So my dad was an electrical engineer for many, many years. He actually ended up working for Rockwell Automation, who's one of the bigger PLC vendors in the world now. But I was always kind of dancing around playing with PLCs because he always had one at the house, or he was always working on it or traveling somewhere to work on a sorter or something. So when I was at my last job, I was doing a zero trust assessment for the Postal Service and learned about the PLCs and the OT environment that they had. Well, when I came over to Woodard & Curran, a lot of the water space is run by these automated systems running on PLCs. And you come in with this idea as an IT person of how you should secure an environment. And that's typical, right? We all kind of know the ins and outs of basic cyber hygiene for any basic IT environment. And as you get better and you get through your organization, it becomes kind of rote. You're like, okay, we need to put a firewall in. We need to lock this down. We need to do multi-factor authentication. We need to do this. The fascinating thing about OT is you can't do all of that. You can do some of it, but a lot of the capabilities that we have in modern IT infrastructure can't be applied to OT because they're legacy systems, or they're systems that have to be very delicately handled. You wouldn't think so because it's manufacturing or it's water, or it's sorters, or it's those kinds of environments. But they have very specific things that have to be very delicately handled. Otherwise, you could shut down the entire system and require it to run manually, or even worse, shut down an entire water plant or a manufacturing plant just in the snap of a fingers by making an IT decision.
That's it. that's something that we have in common is my dad was also an electrical engineer, and so I grew up with this basement full of radios and TVs and oscilloscopes and all that kind of stuff, and I didn't know what any of that stuff really was for, except I remember, and I've told this story before, is I remember that he was so proud because we had one of the first color TVs when that was a big thing, and the problem with that when you have an electrical engineer in your house is that things get fixed. Right.
Yes.
So it would go down into the basement and dad would work on it and fix the snowy picture. And he'd come up and he'd be so proud. And he wanted to tell my mom, he'd say, oh, well, I had to put these diodes and capacitors in there and a couple resistors. And she says, I just don't care. I just want to watch the TV.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad you know that stuff, but I don't need to know all that stuff. And it kind of goes to that, big picture thing of what the CISO needs to be able to communicate is, we don't have to get into all those bits and bytes that we have there. Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about, the systems and being legacy systems and can't touch them. How do we patch our OT systems and, when we have things like water plants and so forth that need to be running continuously?
So patch management is probably one of the biggest challenges in OT security, because not only can the patches cause issues with interacting with the environment as a whole, but they can actually not interact with systems that you have in place if you upgrade. So for example, there was a story that I was related where there was a patch for a system and the company had just purchased brand new monitors that worked with this environment. And the patch actually made the monitors useless. So the company had invested like $160,000 in these specialized monitors that were now not usable. And it wasn't something that you could easily roll back. So there's excessive testing that has to be done. There has to be excessive planning. And again, like you said, water systems have to be running all the time. So you really have to organize a very regimented schedule to say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to implement this update. We've tested this update and we know what the interactions are going to be or don't know what it's going to be. And unfortunately, that's part of the biggest challenge because a lot of the smaller water systems don't have someone to take the time to do this testing, or they don't have the availability to shut down that amount of time to run in manual to do the update and then come back online. So you see some systems are either unpatched because of that time or unpatched because they're old. I mean, PLCs started coming out in the 1970s, and some are still in operation today, I can assure you, in some environments. So it's also a matter of, getting to how do we modernize too? And that's a challenge because PLCs are expensive. And in the water space, how do you define what's critical? Do you upgrade the PLC or do you upgrade the water main that just broke downtown? Which is going to be more impactful to the community? Of course, the water main is, because there's a whole community that either has to boil water or can't get water right now. So looking at investment in that space too is a challenge, which is why I'm really happy that, the Infrastructure Act has put in these grants that small municipalities can get to help enhance that. But there's still challenges there too, where they may not have a grant writer to help them get that visibility and get that money.
How do we assess those threats if we have all these old systems running? It seems like that would be just a wonderful place for a nation state to say, oh, let's go after the water plants. Let's go after the electrical grid. Let's go after the manufacturing companies because we know their stuff is really old. So how do we assess that risk?
It's a really great question that I think we're still trying to figure out. A lot of organizations still have the mentality of that won't happen here. And we're starting to see where it is happening. We saw a attack in Israel. We saw oil systems where Iran actually had individuals who knew PLCs and knew how to program them infiltrate a facility to reprogram the PLCs so that with the flick of a switch, it would explode the refinery. They actually got charged by the DOJ. So I think we're still trying to figure that out. One of the primary things that we can do is isolate the networks. And of course, there's frameworks. There's the IEC 62443. There's 852 for NIST that do provide some boundaries for how to protect these OT SCADA environments in an effective way. But, it's really understanding your environment, looking at your threats, not just as IT threats, but looking at your OT threats, especially looking at like remote systems. We've seen so many things around water systems building in remote access, but some of them are still doing, basic TeamViewer or GoToMeeting free, whereas that's one of the entry points that you can actually put multi-factor authentication on, so you should. And so there's also the physical ramifications. Understanding that physical threat where somebody can infiltrate and walk in and reprogram that system very quickly is also a big concern that we need to pay attention to. Gates should be locked. You should have bollards. You should have some kind of key fob or some kind of access control to get into the building as much as you can to keep your firewalls isolated. The biggest thing to do to protect OT environments is keep IT and OT separate, because OT needs to be isolated in its own world, especially because it's legacy. It's just like a Windows NT box. If we're looking at IT efficiency, there are still people out there who are still using NT, that are still using 2000. I mean, look at the pandemic, and they were looking for COBOL programmers for unemployment systems. Those legacy systems are either micro-segmented off or isolated in their own environments with very strict internal controls. So isolating it off adds an extra level of security, because IT is a huge risk to OT. There's been several instances where the IT and OT were connected, someone got ransomware, and that went into the systems, and then everybody had to run in manual for an extended amount of time. While many plants can run in manual, not all of them can. And so that can be a very dangerous situation. It can also be a very costly situation, because if you're used to running stuff with humans only part of the time, having to run in manual 24/7 for an extended period while you remediate the ransomware threat can be very expensive. So we did an estimate of an attack that we were familiar with, and we estimated between $400,000 and $600,000 for one event.
And so we've had several of these big events. The Colonial Pipeline is the one that comes to everybody's mind, because consumers seem to understand cybersecurity when it affects them physically, when it's something that stops them. And that was actually on the IT side where there was an issue. So do you look at those two issues together with the IT and the OT, or how do you manage that?
You have to marry them, and you have to balance, right? So there's still going to be IT aspects of OT security. You're still going to need a firewall. You still have to build a network. You still have to give these systems an IP, and you still have to monitor them. I think one of the things that is fascinating is people think that these OT systems just run on their own and they're totally fine and you don't need to monitor them. Well, monitoring that activity is still very important. So you talk about Colonial Pipeline. One of the biggest things that I've paid attention to in the past few years was two cases. So Oldsmar, Florida was really what piqued my interest in the space. And of course, now there's speculation that was just, somebody did an oops, which is totally fine, but oopses are just as dangerous, right? But then there was also a situation in Discovery Bay, which I think is in California, and they had a contractor. The contractor was a plant worker. He installed a whole bunch of software to remote into the system, and nobody knew it. And then they terminated that employee. He was unhappy about that termination, remoted in, and started to delete things out of the PLCs and cause some damage. That individual is actually indicted for computer crimes and will be likely going to prison. Though personally, I would say because of the criticality of water, I would almost think that that's almost terrorism. But I'm not a judge or a lawyer, so I can't speak to that.
So what sort of incident response plans do you put together, and are they separate from IT, or how do you manage that?
So they would be separate from IT. The OT systems are going to have different emergency response plans, and that's a requirement through the American Waterways Infrastructure Act, OEA, and other organizations. EPA is starting to really hammer with the sanitary inspections. While they've been put on hold because of the injunctions in Missouri, there's still states like Massachusetts, for example, that are still moving forward with the inspections. And most of what we're seeing come back on that is, do you have an incident response plan for your OT systems? How do you manage an interruption of services? So for that, we're going to have to engage other people. It may be a playbook as part of our incident response procedures on the IT side or in the bigger cybersecurity ecosystem, but it's going to be mostly the OT engineers. It's going to be our SCADA folks who understand the system and have built it from scratch. And they're going to be the ones who are going to be doing the actions. So cybersecurity may only be in if there's an actual cyber incident where someone's remoted in and we'll have to get discovery in and start doing analysis of logs. Or if in the case of OT and IT being connected for some random reason, like we didn't know about, then we would be in to work on the IT side to remediate the disruption.
So, do you have to worry about, is it in your risk assessment around any sort of like hacktivism that may be coming? I guess I'm just thinking of all the strikes that are going on right now, and some of them with, some of our car manufacturers. Do you see those as risks, or is that not thought of too much?
I think we're still evolving the risk profile for water. I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, we have Water ISAC, which is an information sharing organization for water plants and their partners. A lot of what we're seeing as incidents is mostly domestic. I can't even say hacktivism, really. It's not like, oh, we're we need to save the trees or something. It's mostly like we want to stop something from happening. So there's been incidents where people have shot water towers and started a leak there. But when we're looking at what threats there could be, I mean, if somebody could infiltrate and reprogram a water system, it could be very, very dangerous. So I think we're still evolving those threat profiles. It's something that's on our radar, but I think some of the bigger threats is really just trying to isolate those networks and make sure that they're protected from human error, really.
Mm-hmm. What are some of those key controls that CISOs operating in the OT environments should have in place for prevention and detection and monitoring?
So there's lots of people trying to get into the OT monitoring space, and I would warn people against IT companies trying to do OT, because there's a lot of people jumping into that environment that may not have the familiarity with what is going on those systems and may not be able to monitor effectively. We've spent 18 months at my company evaluating different monitoring systems to put in place for our water sites. And we've seen where companies are like, oh, we're doing OT now. But then they start talking about doing it as IoT. And IoT is not OT in the slightest. My PLCs at a water plant are not my Nest thermostat at all. Even to the point of, we were talking about our parents. So right before my dad retired, at one point, he called me and he said, I need to know how to subnet because we're starting to do networking with these PLCs. And this was like 2012, 2013, maybe. And I was like, yeah, there's a calculator for that. You don't have to do the math. He's like, you don't? I'm like, no, go to this website. But that's where we are, right? They're still trying to catch up. So I think for CISOs or anyone who's handling an OT environment, definitely rely on your SCADA engineers because they're going to know the ins and outs of those environments and let them kind of dictate how they want to protect it. I mean, they're going to tell you immediately, we don't want to be connected to the IT environment. So you're going to want to segment those networks off. I know some environments do it logically. Physical separation is probably the best just because you don't want to see some random mess up on a switch, a reprogramming of a configuration, and have it be completely destroyed. Additionally, we have the firewalls. You want to have a very good firewall to keep attacks from coming in, and you don't want anything except for what is absolutely necessary to go out. PLCs don't need to communicate with the internet. Neither does the HMI that communicates with those PLCs. So unless you have some kind of analytic system that may need a historian, or even that would be isolated on a DMZ, really there should be no outgoing traffic from those networks. If there's outgoing traffic from those networks, figure out what it is and why, and either isolate it so that it can only go to that one IP, or shut it down. We've had a lot of vendors that have come in to do different tooling or want to do different things, even these monitoring vendors, and we're like, we have to limit the amount of stuff that goes out. And they go, oh, we only use port 443. And we're like, well, okay, that's fine. And then we get into actually like doing a proof of concept, and they're like, okay, we need this port open, we need this port open, we need this. And we're like, no, we're not going to open all these ports. The other thing that is really imperative is education. Understanding the importance of cyber hygiene and understanding insider risk and insider threat, and being aware of what your surroundings are doing, but also understanding why the importance for multi-factor authentication, why the importance for only having this connectivity, the importance for not plugging in other devices on that network, because they can totally break the system. We had a client site once where somebody plugged a camera into the SCADA environment and it took everything offline. We were like, what's going on? And it's because it was trying to pull an IP address that it couldn't pull. So it's really understanding the nuances within that environment, and then leaning on the people who understand those nuances better than we can.
What pain points do you see between the IT security teams and the OT teams?
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. I think IT thinks if it's connected to the network, it's going to have a simple operating system or some way to control it, and that we can do everything that we can do on our regular IT systems. People are like, oh, just put multi-factor authentication on it. And it's like, no, these systems aren't built for that. You have to find a mitigation, whether it's putting multi-factor on the device that connects to them, or, again, on the case of the remote system, if you're remoting in, definitely put in some kind of multi-factor to make sure that random teenager or random Joe can't just log in at any random point. I think educating IT on the differences is really important, but there's also this kind of almost challenge where sometimes IT's like, oh, that's OT, I don't want to touch it. But in order to have a good cybersecurity ecosystem, everyone kind of has to play together and work together. So you have to understand how this affects you and how it affects the business as a whole. Our organization may not see OT as a huge concern until you take it into the bigger context, right? So they may be like, oh, OT's safe, it's totally fine, it's isolated off, everything's great. Well, what if someone came in and reprogrammed it? And didn't do damage to the system per se, because the damage to the system is going to be expensive, because PLCs are expensive, and there's also a manufacturing delay. I don't know how long it is now, but a while ago it was like 11 months to get a new PLC. But it's also a human problem, especially in the water space, because if that system goes down, or somebody changes the chemical composition of the water, you could poison an entire community. And that is the end of the story for that organization, because human lives are expensive.
Yeah. And that's where that risk assessment is so important. Well, Mea, this has been great talking about this. I mean, I think it's such an important issue, and we probably have more OT in our environments than we're actually recognizing. What advice would you give to CISOs as they go down this journey and they're involved in OT security?
Let go of everything you think of as IT security when you go into talking to OT. And then again, lean on your SCADA engineers or your OT experts in the field, because they're going to know the ways to best isolate those systems. Even if you offer a suggestion, they may say this may not work because of X, Y, and Z. And then isolate.
Well, that's great advice. Well, thanks a lot, Mia. Thanks for taking the time today.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.